originally up to about 200 now. But you also said some people in the deaf community don't understand the role of a deaf interpreter. Has the growth come because of demand within the community? And is there a growing sense of the understanding of the benefits of having a deaf interpreter working in a team with hearing interpreters? Or how do those two different statements that in some ways conflict lead to the change that you've mentioned?
I think many people have noticed in the past that there was something missing in the process. And it's not just the deaf community, it's also professional interpreters, professional hearing interpreters, who recognized there was something different and they needed support. So many people in the deaf community are still unfamiliar with what deaf interpreters can offer and what services they can provide. And it may not be until they experience something like going to a hearing at a court and realizing that they don't fully understand what's going on in the court proceedings. And that might be the moment when they realize they would prefer to have a certified deaf interpreter so they can understand more about what's going on in front of them in the court proceedings. And so things like that have served to increase demand for certified deaf interpreters.
I've noticed lately there have been a number of deaf interpreters that have made the mainstream news, recently because they're serving as interpreters for press conferences related to the different storms or natural disasters that have been occurring. Is that a shift in the field to have them in that position, or is it just that with social media we're seeing it a lot more than we used to?
It had happened before, but you're right. I think that the exposure is different now. I would say in the last couple of years we've seen deaf interpreters serve in that role more often. The nice thing about having deaf interpreters in a role like that is that the deaf interpreters are able to communicate in a way that is very crisp and clear, and the message is very succinct, and it's just presented in a way that's very easy to understand for the deaf audience. And so I wouldn't say it's all that new, but I would say the last couple of years it's been the case. FEMA has started using deaf interpreters in the last couple of years more often, and I would think that probably the impetus was Hurricane Katrina, right around the time of Hurricane Katrina. A lot of deaf people in the audience just didn't understand the message presented in press conferences and things like that, and so they realized that they needed to have interpreters visible, and so FEMA has started working with deaf interpreters much more often. And so, yeah, I would say it's a phenomenon of the last couple of years.
I want to jump back to something that you mentioned before, that for deaf interpreters, sometimes reading the visual cues or the visual aspects is easier than for a hearing interpreter. You said that they might have more challenge understanding that aspect of the language. Someone had asked specifically if there are concepts that are difficult to translate or interpret from a sign language into a non-signed language, and vice versa, if you have any examples of those.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that. Sometimes comedy is very difficult to interpret. Comedy is very culturally based, and it's often a play on words, and so comedy is very difficult to present in an equivalent way. So the impact on the audience is not going to be the same. Anything that's culturally based, it requires cultural knowledge to be able to understand it, I mean, whether it's comedy or not. If it's strongly culturally based, it's not going to translate. So there's a sign, for example, that is presented and looks sort of like a train and the train having left the station. That sign is commonly interpreted as, it's too late, or you missed the boat, or you missed the train, or you missed, something. It conveys the message that it's too late. The ASL that's used is the sign for train, and the train leaving the station and leaving you behind. And so coming up with the appropriate English for that phrase used in that moment, in that context, can be challenging sometimes. And so that's an example. That would be an example of something that would be an idiom.
That's a great example. Another one of the listeners asked a question along the same lines. Apparently, Eskimos have many different words for snow, but in English we just have the one word, snow, regardless of the variety. Are there words like that in American Sign Language, that maybe there's only one sign, but there's many English words, or vice versa? Maybe there's one English word, but there are many different signs that express that word.
I don't know if this is an example of this, but the sign for run, the English word run, R-U-N, in English it can mean many things. It can mean, your nose is running, or you're running like an athlete, or you run an organization, or you run for president, as in running during the election. And so there are many uses of that word. And I don't know if this is an example of what you're talking about, but in English, run just sounds like run. But in ASL, those are all different signs. Another example might be key. So in English, the word is key. But in ASL, there's a sign that means key as in important, key as in the key that opens your door. Glass might be another example. So in English, the word is glass, but in ASL, there's a sign for the substance that your window is made out of. There's a sign for the object that you drink out of as a container. There's, even your lenses and your glasses. And so I don't know if that's what you were referring to.
Yeah, exactly. Those are great examples, and I think for many people who have never learned a sign language, those may be very enlightening. That it's not one word equals one sign.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. The process the interpreter goes through is they take the entire message. They're not looking at one individual word. And the grammatical structure of ASL isn't the same as the grammatical structure of English. It would be like thinking that the grammatical structure of spoken French and the grammatical structure of spoken English is the same. They aren't. They all have their own nuances, even though there are similarities across languages. Spanish is different than English, even though there are family connections across language families. So American Sign Language and English are not the same.
To me, it seems like being a deaf interpreter is a very unique skill set. Are there circumstances that make you feel that you have some sort of superpower because of that skill?
I don't know. No, I wouldn't say so, no. I'm not sure exactly how to say it. I really feel humble about the responsibility I have. I work collaboratively with the deaf consumer and my hearing interpreter team and the hearing consumers. I wouldn't say I have a superpower. I think we're all working collaboratively to make sure the communication happens. We all show up and we have different skills to bring to the table, and we're all there with the one goal of making sure that the communication happens.
What from your job brings you the greatest joy?
Really, I think that working with deaf-blind consumers is my favorite thing. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but I love it. So deaf and blind people, I don't know. It can easily sound like there's pity involved in helping somebody who's less fortunate, but really that's not what I'm talking about at all. What I'm talking about is I love communicating with them. I love helping the message get from them to the person that they want to speak with, and vice versa, making them understand what the people around them are saying to them. And I love it.
A number of listeners asked about what those of us who are hearing that might not have exposure to deaf culture can do. One person specifically asked, what are things that we hearing folks do that are hurtful or offensive that we might not realize are hurtful or offensive?
That's a great question. I need to think a little bit more about that. That's really an outstanding question. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. Just off the top of my head, I would say that the idea that being deaf is an impairment. I think many people use the words hearing impaired, and many deaf people who sign and use American Sign Language, we refer to ourselves as deaf. And deaf is not offensive. And so it's more offensive to us to say hearing impaired. Often, if you want to include people who are not culturally deaf and not necessarily ASL users, you could say deaf and hard of hearing, for example. And that's also acceptable as a catch-all phrase for a larger community. But yeah, hearing impaired has a lot of baggage, and it carries with it the medical view of hearing loss that isn't really what we're talking about. And so I would say that. I can't really think of other examples, but that's one that I would say is kind of offensive.
Another person asked, what should I as a hearing person do if I don't have any sign language knowledge, if I meet a stranger who is deaf? What is the best way to engage if an interpreter is not available?
Well, you can write back and forth. Paper and pencil is always a perfectly acceptable thing to try. Sometimes I'll go to a store and I'll have a notepad with me and I'll try to write with someone, and hearing people look scared or offended or put off by that. You could also try and gesture. Sometimes hearing people are afraid to gesture. Pointing, using mime, acting things out, that's perfectly acceptable. There are things that are very easy to come up with on the spot, like the sign for flowers or the sign for drink or to look for something. Those things are things that most people can figure out. And so just trying to gesture with someone to engage and communicate is a perfectly acceptable approach.
I believe it was the same listener who asked, what are your recommended strategies for people who are outside the deaf community to advocate to have a more inclusive community or a more inclusive environment for deaf individuals?
Well, learning how to sign ASL, I think, is the number one thing. If I'm somewhere and I see people signing, I feel much more comfortable and much more welcome. If you have customers or neighbors or whoever it might be, and you expect them to lip read, that's a big turnoff right there. But if someone is trying to fingerspell or use whatever rudimentary sign language they have, or again, like I mentioned, gesture, that goes a long way in making deaf people feel welcome.
If someone is in a situation where an interpreter is present, how do you work with an interpreter, or what are your recommendations? That probably should have been my first question.
Oh, really? The number one rule about working with an interpreter is you speak directly to the deaf person. So you make eye contact with the deaf person and you speak to them as if they can hear you. So instead of saying, oh, tell Stephen, instead of doing that, you just speak to me as if I can hear you, and the interpreter will interpret your message for you. And again, it's really important to look at the deaf person. Don't look at the interpreter, because you're really speaking to the deaf person. You're not speaking to the interpreter. You're speaking through the interpreter, and so it makes sense that you might think that, but you really want to look at the deaf person. It can be really disconcerting to have the hearing person looking at the interpreter all the time when they're really speaking to me. And so I think that would be the number one tip I would give.
You've mentioned a lot of different strategies. Are there resources you can think of off the top of your head where people can start looking if they need an interpreter, if they would like to learn ASL, or if they just want to get a better understanding of the field? Are there places they can look?
If you're looking for a sign language interpreter, there are resources on the internet. You can go to www.rid.org. There are resources there that can help you find an interpreter, documents that help explain what an interpreter does. And if you just look at the menus and navigate through the menus, that can help you find an interpreting agency or an interpreter in private practice in your area. So that's one way to start. If you're wanting to learn American Sign Language, you can also start at the internet. Most community colleges all across the country have American Sign Language courses. We have American Sign Language courses here at Gallaudet University. There are some American Sign Language courses offered online. There's some courses that are offered in a hybrid fashion, so that they're partly online and partly in person in the classroom. So, and again, community colleges all across the U.S. offer sign language classes. And so I think that's really a great place to start. And again, not every college or university is going to offer sign language classes, but community colleges are really an affordable and very convenient place to start. Most major cities have them. And again, if you just start with the internet and see what they have available, you'll find many community colleges that do offer American Sign Language. You also mentioned getting more involved. If people want to get involved with the deaf community, there's not one way to do it. There are many, many different ways, and there's not one place to go for resources. If you live near a residential school for the deaf, we have a residential school for the deaf on campus at Gallaudet University, for example. One way to start getting involved is to contact the schools and find out if there are plays or sporting events. If you live in California, there are residential schools out there.